welcome back to Identity Insights by Indicio. I'm your host, Tim Spring, and today I'm joined by Indicio Deputy CTO Sam Curren, and he's here to discuss the basics of DIDComm. This is the first in a three-part series in which we'll seek to understand the general concepts and goals of DIDComm. Then we'll take a deeper technical dive into how it's achieved, and finally, we'll take a look at how businesses can use it in the real world and how it could affect your organization. Thank you so much for joining me today, Sam. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, happy to be here. Sam Curren. I have been involved in the identity space for a bit, and specific to DIDComm, I am involved in both the Aries ecosystem inside of Hyperledger, and I have served as a co-chair of the DIDComm spec working group at the Decentralized Identity Foundation for the formalization of DIDComm version 2. I can talk about that in a minute, but that's how I'm involved, and I'm still involved in those capacities.
So I'd love for you to give us a bit of a background on DIDComm, but before we really jump in, I think it's important for people to know exactly what we're talking about. Would you mind giving us a brief, just kind of explanation of what DIDComm means and DIDComm is, particularly around a DID, because I know that's an abbreviation already.
Absolutely. So DIDComm is a message protocol, or a way to send messages between two owners of a DID. So DIDComm is obviously in the name. So you need a DID that is capable of having a service endpoint, and then of course DIDs have public keys in them. And based off of that information, you can then send secure messages to another party that has the same properties. What that gives you is a secure way to message between any two parties that hold a DID, whether those parties are a person, an organization, or even a thing in the case of an IoT device.
So before we move on real quick, DID, right? What is a DID? If you could just that term for the people that are really new at home, what does DID stand for?
Totally. That's a decentralized identifier. And starts with DID colon and then a method name and then some other garbly stuff that you don't normally see. Humans don't tend to see them in well-developed software. Of course, when you see developer-oriented things or demonstrations, you'll see DIDs because it's a developer-oriented thing. DIDs are a little like IP addresses in the sense that normal humans don't typically see them, but they are a mechanism used behind the scenes in order to make things on the internet work.
So, right, obviously you've been involved with the DIF and DIDComm for a little bit. What made you get involved in the project?
So I have a kind of an interesting origin story here. I got back into the identity community. I was in it for a while and then out for a number of years doing working in a different space. And when I came back into the identity community, I had one thing in mind. I had realized that one of the fundamental imbalances of the internet was the fact that companies or products could have an API, but it was really difficult as a person to have an API. I didn't have an API. But how cool would it be if I did? Restaurants could call my API to see what allergens I had or something. And that was the idea that I came back to. Actually, I sort of came back into the community by re-attending IW after having not been there for a little while. And I had this idea in my head about a personal API. And like, how can we get people APIs? How can they be sort of on equal footing on the internet instead of sort of being always the client that calls the API rather than the person who has the API that gets called? And when I got there at the time, I'm not even going to hazard a guess on exactly what year this was, but the DIDs were becoming a thing, and using blockchains for identity was becoming a thing. And at the time, there was something that we called an identity container, which is not a term that anyone uses anymore. An identity container was a thing that related to on-chain data, but was not actually on-chain at all. And those identity containers later became agents, or wallet is another common term that people are using for that. And so the idea is this identity container was like, could represent or could interact with you on behalf of things. And I realized there that there was a lot of value there. And in fact, that approach was better than the personal API approach that I sort of came to discuss. And then got back in the community. So identity containers became agents. I became familiar with Indy. Indy had agents, but they were not the Aries agents that we think of today. They were a little bit more focused. DIDs became a thing. And so when we talked about exactly how to communicate between agents, then DIDs was a natural thing to include there. And agents needed to talk off-chain about on-chain things. Now, the on-chain aspect has become a lot less important as it all developed, including with things like peer DIDs that aren't registered on any chain at all, but still allow things like DIDComm to function. But that ability to actually talk between parties on the internet in a secure way that has those advantages became what is DIDComm, and that is a better approach than what I had in my head way back then, which was this personal API. DIDComm can allow communication between person to person or person to organization in a way that's kind of like an API, but deliberately architecturally designed to place all of the participants in something on equal footing, which is one of the advantages that DIDComm has as a technology. So I came at this with not trying to make DIDComm, but with this idea that I wanted something, and then I realized through conversing with us in the community and all the conversations there that there was something better that I could do than a personal API, and that it turned out to be agents that speak DIDComm using DIDs.
Absolutely. So you said quite a bit there, which I appreciate. I love the history lesson and kind of how it all came about.
Well, it's my personal history lesson, right? Everyone's got a story of how they come into this. This was uniquely personal to me in the sense that that's how I sort of ended up in this space and working on the stuff that I care about.
Yeah. So if I could summarize real quick, just my personal takeaway, and you can tell me if this is true or not. So DIDComm is essentially two, decentralized uh, agents being able to communicate through some kind of communication chain, right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned something interesting, which was the equal footing aspect. I'm wondering how that's achieved with DIDComm. If that's not too technical, if not, we can dive into
No,
it later.
I think this is important. And I have to give credit here to Daniel Hardman, who within the last couple of weeks wrote a blog post called Big Desk Little People. And that's worth looking up. And he talks about the emergence of APIs on the internet and how APIs allowed integration between systems across the internet in a really great way. One of the nice things that happened is that it ended up being very language specific. So it didn't matter what programming language you were on both sides. You had a standard way to sort of communicate between these systems. And it's great design. It's in heavy use today. It's good, but there's a problem with it. The architecture of APIs means that there is fundamentally a client and a server. Now, it's technically true that you can have software that is both an API client and an API server. That's not uncommon, but to have an API, having the API server that offers an API to other parties is a position of power on the internet, and it means that other people can come to you and can interact on your terms. That's hard because the devices that we use as people, as humans on the internet, generally don't have what it takes to become an API server. We use laptops, we use phones, and other small, more portable internet-connected devices. They typically have interrupted data signal. They're on different Wi-Fi networks, or sometimes their battery runs out, or they're just turned off, and that's generally makes it really hard to have an API that people can expect to get to on your as they communicate with you. DIDComm is created using it's a message-oriented architecture rather than an RPC or a remote procedure call architecture. And what these messages allow for is the communication between parties with delay. So you can send me a message and I might not get it right away because I'm in a bad cell spot, but when I do come into a better one, to better signal, I can receive that message and then act upon it. And because the organizations and people and things honestly can all communicate using that message oriented architecture, we all have the same ability to send and receive those messages as interactions. And so no longer is there a difference between the person who has the API or the entity that has the API and the entity that calls the API. And that equal footing part, I believe, is very necessary to create the kinds of trusted relationships that we need on the internet moving forward. People have became second-class citizens on the internet. We used to be first-class citizens, and that was very true, particularly in the days back of email. I had an email address, and so did a corporation, and I could email them, and we both had the same abilities to send and receive email. And since then, we have the consolidation of social media. Blogging was another thing where we were more on equal footing, but all of the sort of self-publishing stuff on the internet got consolidated into very large companies that sort of manage that and to make that happen. Ironically, Daniel Hardman's post on Big Desk Little People is hosted on Medium, which is an aggregated blog thing instead of a self-hosted blog. And you could argue that that's not good or bad about that, but the point is that this type of aggregation into larger systems means that people have not been first-class citizens for a while. We have always been subject to the types of services that these large players want to offer. And DIDComm allows a platform for the development of newer technologies on the internet, where all of the participants in a conversation are on equal footing from a technology capability perspective. Now, there's still relationships there. If I'm communicating with my bank over DIDComm, my bank is still my bank and I'm still a person, which means that like they can hold value for me, but I can't really hold value for them because that relationship's different. But from a technology perspective, we are interacting back and forth using a technology where the technology itself does not place one of us at a disadvantage. And that's the really important.
That sounds awesome. That's I love the idea behind it. I'm curious, right? When sorry, we kind of got off track here, so I'm going to bring us back to the DIDComm and its initiative. But when it was first kind of coming together, right back when you were getting back into the identity space, uh, were there any goals set for the program? Was it just like create this, way to communicate between decentralized devices? Was there any, this is what success looks like, this is like the greater goal, or what was the
There were some, but they weren't really articulated in quite those ways. We didn't realize what we were embarking on when we started the journey. Um, the indie project had this concept of an agent, but it was very hyper specific to indie. It was only tied to indie networks and only really worked with indie networks. And we recognized that the value of agents is far more than something like a single network. And so the indie project spun out the Aries agent work with the purpose of connecting to all sorts of different networks and we didn't realize the terms at the time, but all sorts of different DID methods and all sorts of different credential types that could actually be passed around. And that was in the spirit of the Aries project from the beginning. That has traveled, that has expanded less than I would have liked in the Aries community, mostly because the people that began working on Aries were people that came from a background of indie. And so a lot of the users of Aries are still doing indie things with it. But not all the code bases do. There are code bases that actually started out and for a long time didn't connect with an indie network at all, but were still Aries agents that interacted with in this way. So our goal was to communicate. We recognize that when you use a ledger, there's some trade-offs there. You gain the ability to publish and share verifiable data with lots of people, but lots of the interactions that we have, we don't want to publish to everyone. We want it to be very private. And so we recognize the need to have off-chain interactions that could be, again, at the time, based on-chain assets like public keys that were published in relation to DIDs. And so the goal was to enable that off-chain communication. That was basically the fundamental piece of it. As we got into it, we recognized different values and different approaches of doing so. And we had a lot of really heated debates very on in the Aries community about how that would happen. And I say in the Aries community, we hadn't named DIDComm yet. It was just like agent-to-agent communication type of a thing in the early days. And we gradually realized that just like Indie saw a broader application of the agent concept, Aries saw a broader application of the DIDComm concept. And so it ended up kind of getting a name. And then at some point, we sort of minted what became DIDComm version 1. We weren't working on version 1 at the time because we didn't really have a name. And then eventually there became a greater interest in using DIDComm, but outside of Aries specific projects. And so with that interest, we started up a working group at the Decentralized Identity Foundation that's totally separate from Hyperledger's Aries project to develop the next version of DIDComm. And so we had some interaction from outside the Aries community there and worked on version 2, which is the newest version of that spec. And there's a bunch of improvements. The protocol got simpler, which is a benefit. Whenever you can remove complexity from something, you're heading in the right direction, without satisfying the features that you needed. And so it got simpler and got better. And DIDComm v2 is now, of course, the protocol that is being targeted for development not only outside of the Aries community, but also inside the Aries community. There's substantial efforts to adopt DIDComm v2 and replace DIDComm v1 as the mechanism that's used for communication between those agents.
Would you be able to articulate kind of some of the key differences between version 1 and version 2 and why people would want to upgrade?
Sure.
Besides
DIDComm v2 got simpler in a couple of ways. DIDComm v1 had some special handling for peer DIDs. which was valuable and we recognized at the time. That special handling went away, and we pushed the need to handle the encoding of various things back onto the pure did method itself. And so that happened, and that brought a lot of uniformity to how it happened. The other major difference is that in DIDComm v1, we had this handshake protocol. You would start a connection by exchanging information back and forth with another party. In a DIDComm v2, we figured out how to make the right adjustments so that you could send a message. As long as you knew the did of the other party, you could send a meaningful message as the very first message without having to go through a handshake first. And so that's actually substantially more powerful. It allows for a greater array of connection sort of styles. And I'll give an example. In DIDComm v1, you had a full connection where you went through the exchange and then you could exchange lots of messages. And then you also had the development of what they called a connectionless exchange. And that if you only wanted to do one specific thing, like exchange a credential, for example, there was this connectionless thing that had additional information in the message, but would allow you to avoid the initial handshake before it got started. In a DIDComm v2, we figured out how to include the right information with every message such that you could communicate directly with the other party meaningfully from the very first message. And what that means is that, in effect, every connection is both connectionless and a full connected thing, and the parties get to decide how long they want that relationship to exist. And as soon as it's not useful for one of them, they can just make it go away.
So I know there are a lot of different efforts to make communication happen across the internet, whether decentralized or direct communications. Would you mind telling me a little bit more about how DIDComm is kind of special in the way that it does that?
So DIDComm itself, one of the obvious applications for DIDComm is actually verifiable credentials. A lot of there are DIDComm verifiable credential exchange protocols for the issuance and presentation of credentials, and so that's a lot of the attention about where it's going, right? And that's not inappropriate. Credentials are a great thing to pass over DIDComm, but DIDComm itself actually doesn't have a specific opinion, neither about the type of credential that's being passed, or even if you're talking about credentials at all. And so DIDComm can be used for all sorts of useful things, human-based communication or the communication of other semantic information that is really useful. And so it's a meta protocol in a way that it allows you to define meaningful protocols on top of it that then use all the features that DIDComm sort of provides in a batteries included kind of a way. And so it's a powerful way to build things because of all the stuff that we talked about before on equal footing and that pure nature of things, but also because you can build a protocol kind of like you can build an API without having to build all the stuff underneath it. And I think that's really valuable because you can get started with it. You can build some really powerful things and then not have to worry about all of the underlying details in order to make something successful.
So I know we've talked a lot in abstracts today, and I was wondering if there's any examples that you could point people toward, like you mentioned for banking and stuff earlier. Are there any examples of DIDComm that someone might be able to, either read up more on or maybe even download and use themselves today?
You mean outside of verifiable credentials or just uses themselves?
If you have any, I'd love
including
one for inside and outside of verifiable credentials because I do know that.
Yeah. Perfect. So inside of verifiable credentials, you have the issue, credential, and present proof protocols, and there's been several versions of those as new features have been added. And those protocols are useful for issuing and presenting credentials of JSON-LD credentials or non-creds credentials. And because they're credential type agnostic, those protocols that'll eventually include things like SD-JOTs and even ISO MDL credentials are capable of passing across those protocols. Outside of verifiable credentials, there are protocols that have existed for a long time. Two interesting ones are it's called basic message. Think of this like SMS messaging where it's human oriented, but it's passing across that semantic platform. And another one is a question answer protocol where you can pose a question to the other party and then get a response back from them. And there'll be more protocols along those lines that help with the types of interactions that we have. For example, it's entirely reasonable. No one's defined one yet, but it's entirely reasonable to be able to ask questions of a business, like what payment types do you accept, or what are your hours tomorrow, and be able to get a semantically meaningful response back there. Sometimes you can do those things in sort of a chatbot style format, but the ability to message that semantically means that can be integrated in with applications that do some automation in some really cool ways. And so those are some examples. There aren't as many, to be honest, non-credential based protocols as I would like, but we're actively working to present some better examples of those that to help people understand the applications of DIDComm outside of verifiable credentials. And of course, verifiable credentials are also great. One notable add for verifiable credentials is not only the ability to message someone about an issuance or a presentation of a credential, but also about credential revocation. There's a protocol that has been designed to notify the party that the credential they hold has been revoked. And while that doesn't increase security necessarily, the revocation mechanisms work even without this protocol. It's a really nice user experience if you can be warned that a credential you have is revoked before you attempt to go use it. And so protocols like that they don't tend to exist in other types of credential related protocols can support better user experiences because of the additional semantic information you're capable of communicating.
No, that's very cool. I would appreciate if my passport would ping me 3 months before it was going to expire and be like, hey.
Right, you need a new one. This is going to expire. That's a really useful feature, right? So I said semantic a couple times. Let me tell you what I mean by semantics. This is not going to be a dictionary definition. If I'm just sending you something like an email, I can convey lots of information in it, like, hey, we're going to have a barbecue, and like, here's the time and here's the address. But that was all intended for your eyes, and your brain's going to process that. If I pass the same information semantically, it would be marked up in a way that your software could understand that I was giving you a date and a time specifically, and that I was also giving you a location. And because software can evaluate the semantics of that and say, oh, this is a location, it could do things like tell you, oh, well, I just did a quick like driving directions. This could take you half an hour to get there. So you probably want to leave a half an hour before it starts, right? That's the idea of how you can do that. And it's possible to extract semantic information using like text analysis and things, but it's much, much better and more accurate if the information comes semantically. So let's say I get an alert from my bank that I have a low balance on one of my accounts. It could, of course, send me a text message that says, hey, your balance is low on such and such an account. But if they send me that same information semantically, it means that the software that I'm using understands which account they're speaking of and what the actual balance value is in a number perspective, which means that I have software that may be able to act on that automatically rather than everything coming to me as a human, and then I have to sort of, as a human, process that message and do something about it. So a key to automation between systems is actually the semantic communication of important information. So hopefully that provides a little bit of context for that word I keep using.
No, I definitely appreciate it. And that, yeah, I like that opens up a lot more avenues for automation. So I've got just one last question for you. And I know we've talked a lot today, but as this is kind of our intro to DIDComm, I'm wondering if you could kind of sum up if someone takes away like 3 things from our conversation today and just like a basic, what is DIDComm, and why you would kind of want it. Would you be able to sum it up for me just kind of as a few
Yeah,
major
I'll give
takeaways?
that a go.
Yeah.
So DIDComm is a secure and a powerful way to communicate between people, things, and organizations on the internet. It shares some properties with an API, and that it's passing semantically meaningful information, but it's designed in a way that levels the playing field or places all the participants in a position of equal power, which is something that we need for the trusted communication that we need to have on the internet. That's a powerful thing. DIDComm is, of course, useful within the identity community, but DIDComm itself is also useful the same way that APIs are in a wide variety of contexts. And so it's available for use and integration with the software that you're building.
Sounds good. Well, it looks like that is about our time for today. If you at home are interested in learning more about verifiable credential technology, please be sure to go ahead and subscribe to the channel. We'll continue to bring you some more educational content. If you have any questions or specific topics that you'd like for us to cover, please go ahead and leave a comment below. We'll be happy to read and address them. And thank you again to you, Sam. If people want to learn more about DIDComm, I know we're going to have a few more conversations. But if they want to get involved in, the initiative or just want more information somewhere else, where would you suggest they look?
There's 2 places. One would be there's a DIDComm users group at the DIF that is free and open membership. You don't need to be involved there. There's a Discord channel for that, and I can pass along some links that we can include along with this video or the audio if you're listening to it that way. The other thing to be aware of course, is DIDComm.org is the website for this. It has some pretty substantial updates coming in the coming days, and so keep an eye out for those. There's going to be a lot more guides and a lot more linked information that will be useful to you on that site as we continue to improve.